Welcome to the Tech Meets Mental Health interview series. I'm Sherry Marion. In this series, our host, Professor Skip Rizzo, will be engaging in dialogue with various experts in the digital mental health field across the course of the series. Today, Professor Rizzo will interview today's amazing speakers, Drs. Julie Schweitzer and George DuPaul. They're specialists in the field of ADHD interventions. The Tech Meets Mental Health series is presented by Cognitive Leap. Cognitive Leap is a pioneer in the area of digital diagnostic and therapeutic systems designed to address ADHD and other cognitive and mental health conditions. Leveraging advances in virtual reality and using mobile web-based applications, Cognitive Leap takes a human-centric, clinician-driven approach to create and deliver assessment and intervention tools. Our company has a strong research and development team with world-renowned experts who focus on neurology, cognition, psychology, engineering, and artificial intelligence. We've completed and submitted our clinical research on an FDA study for the approval of our virtual reality classroom diagnosing ADHD in children. Our expert in virtual reality and today's host is Professor Skip Rizzo. Skip Rizzo is a professor at USC and director of medical virtual reality. He serves as an advisor and chief science officer for Cognitive Leap, exploring methods to address attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children. Joining Dr. Rizzo today is Professor Julie Schweitzer. Dr. Julie Schweitzer is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Mind Institute at the University of California, Davis. She directs the Attention, Impulsivity, Regulation, AIR, ADHD program at the UC Davis Mind Institute. Her work is translational in nature, where she uses cognitive neuroscience and behavior analytic principles to investigate attention and impulsivity in children and adults in typical development and in ADHD. She is also developing tech-based interventions using virtual reality and gameplay to improve attention, self-control, and academic functioning. She combines fMRI, DTI, eye tracking, behavioral, and clinical measures in her work. She has been awarded several grants from NIH and other federal agencies for work in ADHD, autism, and substance use disorders. Dr. Schweitzer is active in training translational scientists across UC Davis Health. Dr. George DuPaul is professor of school psychology and associate dean for research in the College of Education at Lehigh University. He has extensive experience providing clinical services to children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and their families, as well as consulting with a variety of school districts regarding the management of and support for students with ADHD. He has been an author or co-author on over 250 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 9 books and 2 videos related to ADHD and pediatric school psychology. He is a co-developer of the ADHD rating scale 5, widely used for screening, diagnosis, and treatment evaluation for children and adolescents with ADHD. Dr. DuPaul was School Psychologist of the Year in Pennsylvania in 1999, was a recipient of the 2008 Senior Scientist Award from Division 16 School Psychology of the American Psychological Association, and was named to the Children and Adults with ADHD, CHAD, Hall of Fame in 2008. Currently, he is investigating the effects of early intervention and school-based interventions for students with ADHD, as well as the assessment and treatment of college students with ADHD. During the interview, our participants who are joining us from the webinar can directly ask a question through the Q&A window, while participants from the YouTube live stream can also ask questions in the live chat. We will have around 10 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So let's turn it over to Professor Rizzo and Drs. Schweitzer and DuPaul.
Okay, Sherry, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I just have to say, I'm very excited about this conversation that we're going to be having now. This is an area that's near and dear to my heart, the application of VR to address childhood healthcare conditions. And I really, I think it's an important and less or understudied area in the field of clinical VR. I think that we have to pay attention to trying to do early intervention or do at least some form of assessment at an early age, to be able to specify challenges that kids may face. And I think, I have a bias, of course, but I think that VR provides us with a few opportunities to do that in a very engaging and useful and scientifically informed way. So with all that, I'm going to shut up for a minute, and I'd like to ask our guests, maybe we'll start with Julie. Just spend a minute or two just describing your history and your interest in childhood conditions and so forth. Just a little self-introduction there.
Sure, great. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of our work and my interest in why I think there's so much more room for technology for helping childhood conditions. So I've worked in the field of ADHD for decades at this point. As I mentioned, and also the introduction, I've done some work in autism as well, and some work in substance use disorders. I'm what people now refer to as translational researcher. So I do a fair amount of work. I started out really studying from behavioral, more laboratory behavioral sorts of studies, and been doing neuroimaging since pretty much the beginning, the 1990s. So starting with adults with ADHD, because we really couldn't use pediatric populations in our studies because it involved radiation, PET scanning. But then when fMRI came on the scene, I switched to using fMRI. So that's mainly understanding ADHD and what are the underlying brain processes involved and how that interacts with the environment. And now I continue to do my behavioral studies as well, and some imaging, particularly looking at neurodevelopment and how features of ADHD change with development. So particularly impulsivity and what happens as we see development in the brain. How does impulsive behavior change in terms of what brain structures are involved and how it manifests, whether it's in terms of academic behavior, driving behavior, impulsivity in terms of risk-taking and so forth. More recently, I've been fortunate to team up with a group of epidemiologists where we're looking at how the environment can also interact with ADHD and ADHD symptoms, and with the long-term goal with that work of looking at prevention. So other things in the environment which could potentially increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood for ADHD symptoms. About, I'd say 15 years ago, I really became disenchanted with what we were seeing in terms of interventions with ADHD. And I thought that there had to be a better way to reach more individuals with ADHD, but also use neuroscience-informed interventions. And most of the interventions I saw were really just modifications of what we've been doing for years from parent training, which sometimes we can explain from a neuroscience perspective, but certainly weren't developed with the neuroscience perspective involved. And then as time went on, Skip, we have a mutual friend, Barbara Rothbaum at Emory, who is working in the field of using virtual reality with anxiety. And she kept telling me about you and your work in ADHD. And she said, you've really got to consider using virtual reality with your ADHD work, Julie. And I said, well, I don't have a question. I can't think about how that would relate right now. But eventually, and we could talk more about that later, I realized that there was great potential for VR to answer some of the questions that I had, and also to have greater reach. And that's been one of my biggest concerns about the way we do the traditional style of working with parents, of expecting them to come in once a week. We know interventions with children directly don't work as well typically in the traditional way. So I wanted to see if there are ways to reach more kids, more families, to help them be more successful. And that was a long response to that question. So, sorry for that.
Okay. Well, George, you two have a past relationship with somebody that I have a lot of respect for, Russell Barkley. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you two met, actually?
Yeah. So again, I want to echo Julie's comments at the beginning. Is I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion today. I've been looking forward to this, and so in terms of my work in this field, it really began when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, engaged in research actually that was focused primarily on the effects of stimulant medications like Ritalin on school performance for youth with ADHD. I'm a school psychologist, so I have keen interest in school functioning of this population. And as a function of that, following the completion of my degree, I had the great fortune of working in Dr. Russell Barkley's ADHD clinic program that was at UMass Medical Center in Worcester at the time in the late 80s, early 90s, and coordinated the stimulant medication evaluation clinic there. But became, and I'm going to circle back to the connection with Julie, but let me just complete the thoughts here. But because I'm a school psychologist, I was really interested in what can we do beyond medication, because medication, as effective as it is in terms of reducing symptoms, doesn't necessarily enhance functioning, particularly academic achievement. And so early on in my career, really was interested and continue to be interested in psychosocial and academic interventions that can either supplement or take the place of medication in some instances. And so really have devoted my career to those efforts, as well as assessment to support that assessment, to identify the kids that might gain the greatest benefit from those interventions. And just one other thought, and then I'll talk about our connection. One of the things that I found to be a challenge throughout the intervention research that I've conducted, and this is true for our field, is the lack of transfer of intervention effects to what we would call the point of performance. So for kids with ADHD, we're typically concerned with how are they doing in the classroom, or how are they doing in the home environment, or in the neighborhood or community setting. And the interventions that are going to work best are the ones that are delivered at that point of performance. Unfortunately, we work with parents and teachers, and we can get some great gains there in terms of their implementation of strategies at the point of performance, but they're human beings, right? So they don't, that transfer of effects can have its limitations. And I think technology, including VR, has so much potential to bridge that gap, if you will, between the attainment of skills to implement strategies and implementing them at the point of performance. And so I hope we get a chance to talk a lot about that today. Julie and I actually met when we were both in graduate school. I was at the University of Rhode Island at the time. She was at UMass. We attended a regional, well, I don't know if it was a regional conference, but it was a behavior analysis conference that actually was at UMass. And then we connected later in Dr. Barkley's clinic, because if I'm correct in this, Julie, you collected some of your dissertation data there when I was first starting in that clinic. So we go a long way back to the 1980s. But, we were 9 or 10 years old at the time, so it's not like we're old. But anyway, yeah, I think I've answered your question. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really important point. This was one of the areas that drove me into looking at VR as a tool for developing better systems for assessment and intervention based on the idea of ecological relevance or ecological validity, the idea of doing testing and training within a context that is relevant to the real world to promote generalization. Let's dive right into that. What are your views on this? And is this the area where VR really, if there was one thing you could say, this would, aside from being able to capture performance in real time and all the under the hood things, this is what inspired me in 1998 to build the first virtual classroom and begin researching this area. How do you see that being applied in your work?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, just to echo what's already been said about that, this issue of generalization has always been problematic. It's been problematic for non-pharmacological interventions. But as George mentioned, the medications don't build new skills. The effects are not sustained, and they don't work in all areas. But there's a tremendous need to address skill development in ADHD and performance, and it's the lack of generalization is really going to interfere with how well you're going to have any effects. So that was the driving impetus for me as well, to get into this field. And that has to do with the assessment as well as the intervention, that as mentioned, the assessments that we use, first of all, oftentimes they're not objective, and that's problematic, I feel, but also they're not necessarily representative. And we're missing out on a lot of information. And certainly within the clinic setting, that can be a very artificial setting. So you may not always see the behavior, but I've said for years, somebody with ADHD can walk in, I can talk to them very briefly, and sometimes I can diagnose them very quickly because I have all that experience. Other people I can spend hours and hours with, and I'm still unsure, because a clinic setting is not necessarily representative. And then sometimes from the rating scales, we get very differing perspectives, sometimes from the same person. So a parent rate their child in the clinic sitting across from me at a desk, and then they'll go out into their waiting room and fill out a rating scale, and they'll answer it differently, which has always bothered me. And I think it's because whether they're prompted answering the questions versus just basing it on the paper and trying to look at it. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think we've, at least in the past few years with COVID, I feel like we've had an exponential growth in the number of people thinking they have ADHD, whether there's actually something changing the nature of attention, which is a whole nother discussion. But there's a lot of people seeking treatment, and how many of them have it, how many of them don't, I don't know. So we definitely need to do better than what we're currently doing in terms of assessment.
And to follow up on that, on the treatment side of things, we have similar challenges. Again, the best interventions for those with ADHD are those that are delivered right at the point of performance, because kids with ADHD, being impulsive, having self-regulation deficits, et cetera, they're very sensitive to the immediate context, right? And the immediate consequences in the environment, the immediate aspects of the environment. And so how can we help parents and teachers, because they're going to be the ones in the front lines working with these kids, how can we help them to deliver, the appropriate interventions at the right time and in the right setting? And what do we rely on now? We rely on, kind of the age-old tactics of role plays and, homework, quote unquote, for parents and teachers to do between sessions, which, I don't want to denigrate those things. Those things are helpful, but they bear, particularly role plays, bear little relation to the actual environment where you want to be implementing these things. So I think virtual reality, immersive virtual reality in particular, has so much potential there for example, exposing parents or teachers to example situations, whether that be a classroom or home situation, or for parents, a very challenging situation is going out in the community, grocery store, restaurants, whatever. And in the VR context, we can create similar environments that are, matching the generalization setting that we want the strategies to be used. And presumably through practicing in those pseudo generalization settings, that increases the likelihood that they'll actually use the strategies in the real world generalization settings. I think that's the hope anyway. So anyway, I think there's a lot of potential there.
If you don't mind me interjecting. So George, I saw one of your simulations, and what I think was also really important about it, which made me think about also the anxiety, the use of fear and anxiety, is that the parents were in a situation that evoked a lot of emotion potentially.
Yep.
And I think that's really important for the parent experience what it's like when they're in a situation where there's challenges from their child, there's defiance and so forth, because it can, and when it's in the moment, it may feel very differently than what it does when you're in a clinic setting trying to learn the skills. And I think that's where the VR has that potential, is that it can mimic those physiological, you also experience those physiological responses too. So how are you going to react when your heart is beating and you're feeling emotionally a certain way that you might not when you're just reading it on paper?
Yeah.
That's where I think that's where I think that generalization helps.
That's an excellent point. And I think we, some of the pilot work that we did with parents that, we might get to describing later, that was very much the case, that the parents felt, some realistic emotional reactions. And, the idea would be to desensitize them to some degree so that when they're experiencing those same emotions in the grocery store or somewhere else, they know, well, I can handle this because I did it, I handled it in the practice situation. I can get through this.
I'd like to hear more about the specific ways you've applied VR, but I want to add in another feature for parents. And we noticed this very early on. There was a media report around 2001 where they interviewed a parent of 2 children with ADHD that had come into the lab for the study, and she watched through behind one-way mirror thing and watched the child in this virtual classroom. And when she was interviewed after, she goes, it gave me a window into how utterly distractible they are and how they try to manage it. And I could feel what they were going through. So there's almost an empathy element when you can see a child in a controlled stimulus environment that's laden with distraction, and they're struggling to attend to an assessment in the virtual classroom. I think parents, start to feel a little more that they don't just have a kid that's being bad, but they have a kid that is really challenged by the complexity of these kinds of situations. But anyway,
Can I just add something there quickly, Skip? Because that's really excellent that you did that you have parents observing that. I'm wondering, have you ever had any teachers observe that? Because teachers they're confronted with students with ADHD in the context of a classroom of 20-something kids, and they're focused on what they need to do and the distraction that kid might be causing. I wonder if it would elicit some empathy on their part to see a kid in a structured, simulated environment doing the same thing. So it's not personal to you as the teacher. It's not like they were just after you. They're engaging those same behaviors. I wonder what the impact would be on teachers and teachers' perceptions as a function of that.
I think there's a number of ways, whether it's watching videos of a child in a headset and seeing what they're seeing and what they get pulled to as they turn around and look at different activities other than what they're supposed to be looking at. Putting the teacher through maybe the rigors of maybe a high performance classroom with a lot of distractions might be helpful. But I think that's an important point that we probably should explore. We've taken the actual head movement data of the child, of a standard neurotypical child and a child with ADHD, and put it on these little avatar heads, and it really isolates the movement or the activity, and you can see how when you put them head to head, you can see the neurotypical child. He'll be on task. Maybe he'll get distracted for a second, but gets back on task. But you see the ADHD child, see a paper airplane fly around the room and look at it, and then look up at the ceiling and look around. And you can see how easy it is for them to get derailed. And that kind of visualization, I think, is a useful thing for either parents or teachers to be able to see. How did you, what did you do in your work? How did you get started? What was the spark with VR in your applications, George?
Oh, you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Well, again, the impetus was what we've been talking about. And I was fortunate enough to connect with a professor in our computer science and engineering department who has an interest in application of robotics and VR to youth with disabilities. And so we just started talking about, what are some of the things that we could do together. And as I learn more about the advantages of immersive virtual reality as essentially a replacement for a role play for parents, because I have a parent training program that I'm done a lot of research with, and felt like the IVR experiences could be a good way of replacing role play practice and be give them more realistic opportunities to practice some of the strategies. So the impetus really was kind of the dovetailing of an intervention that I've been working on for a number of years, with conversations essentially with my colleagues in computer science and engineering as to where technology could be leveraged to enhance that intervention program.
What kind of results did you find?
Well, is a very small sample of we had some internal institutional functioning from Lehigh University to do this. It unfortunately happened in the middle of COVID, so we had to move from immersive VR to desktop VR because of the sharing of the headsets wasn't going to work in COVID. And so it was basically proof of concept. So we showed that parents were able to complete these scenarios and use the strategies in those scenarios with various challenging conditions immersed in that. And they found it acceptable and felt like it was helpful to them. We haven't gotten beyond that stage right now. We have tried to seek some funding. So far, haven't been successful in getting external funding, but would like to continue that as an augment to the early intervention behavioral parent training program that we have.
I think the role playing in VR is very, very powerful. We've done work with folks on the high end of the autism spectrum for job interview training with role plays with various job interviewers. And aside from the population actually feeling more able to engage with a virtual person, you've got to keep in mind, like say for job interviewing, you're not going to be interviewed by your vocational counselor that you're comfortable with, that you've known for a while. You're going to be interviewed by a stranger, and that stranger can have a different mood and strategy. And that's one of the areas where VR can mimic those kinds of challenges and present it in an acceptable way. Yeah, Julie, what about you? What was Barbara was one of the sparks. What did you?
Definitely. So the other spark was honestly, I was talking to a parent, and she was talking about how distracted her son was in class, and that just as you described, once he would get distracted from what the teacher was saying, he had a hard time re-engaging. And she said, I wish there was some way I could teach him how to get back on task. And she said, she's a lawyer, and she said when she was in law school, she would go to cafes, and she initially would study in the cafes for her for law school and studying for the bar, and she would be distracted. But she said over time she learned to ignore what was going on around her, so she had built up some sort of habituation to the noise. And I thought about that. And she said, I wish there was a way my son could learn to just ignore the distractors happening in the classroom. And I thought, well, that's not easy to keep recreating that in the classroom, but there might be a way to do that outside of the classroom, because I had been, at that point, I had been involved in a number of studies using cognitive training with children. So children would go home and do cognitive training. It's primarily in working memory and attention. And so I was used to the idea of children practicing at home with computer programs to help with the idea that you're building a skill set. And so that made me think, okay, this might be an opportunity where we could continually recreate an exposure to distractors, like you had distractors in the classroom for your testing, Skip. And I thought, well, what if we continue to expose kids to traditional classroom distractors? Would habituation, just like you're in the coffee shop, set in, and so that you can ignore the barista doing what they're doing and the people sitting next to you, just like in a classroom, can you ignore the kids sitting next to you talking to one another, goofing off, or whatever's happening outside the window? And so that's when we were fortunate enough to be funded by the NIH So we did the first part where we did a small proof of concept study, just to show that over time, when children were given a headset at home, so one group is given a headset where they're practicing being in the VR classroom with distractors. Another group is given the same practice, but without the distractors. And then they come into the lab, and we're looking at eye tracking as our primary outcome. Head tracking is involved in that as well, but eye tracking we feel is more precise. And so we redesigned the whole classroom where we have a lot more animations as part of the distractors and so forth. And we made the students in the classroom look more updated in terms of their apparel and things like that. So we're launching that now. We're trying to make it easier for the parents to implement this at home. And so we have a dashboard so we can see the child's performance to see whether they're engaged in doing their practice at home. So we're at the point where we're relaunching that. It's complicated because we are doing within the classroom, the children are doing a number of tasks, and we're recording their performance as well. And they have academic tasks that they're doing in the classroom. So they are doing the traditional, what we call continuous performance test, which is what's standard in the classroom as a test, but they're also doing academic tests. So they're doing math, they're doing some reading tests, and they're also watching an educational video as well. And we're looking at how well they pay attention. So we're relaunching. But as you know, from our baseline data, we published on that, and similar to what you said in terms of the head tracking, that you see a lot of movement. It's the same thing with the eye tracking, is that the distractor gets them off task where they look away from the whiteboard, but the distractor leads to a series of looks at non-relevant stimuli in the classroom. So the original distractor may look away from that, but then they're looking out the window, they're looking at the avatar pair sitting next to them, they're looking over at any number of things, and it takes them a while to go back to looking at the whiteboard. And so in essence, that's what I think we're talking about, being off task. But we work with Joy Gang, who's a cognitive scientist at UC Davis as well, who's very interested in studying distractibility and attention. And we've just realized the richness that you can get in VR from an assessment technique than our traditional static measures of attention. So it's just, we're able now to look at path analysis. And we're talking about doing machine learning as well to see what different contexts, what emerges and so forth. So I just think in general, how we do our laboratory testing, not just for ADHD, but how we do our laboratory testing about we know about attention needs to be updated, because it's very flat what we know about attention from our standard laboratory tests. So my colleague Joy Gang is now looking at other environments besides classroom environments. So it's pretty interesting that she's developed where she has a shopping environment, and to see what happens when people are in the shopping environment. What does their exploratory behavior look like? How well are they able to use cues and so forth? So there's so many different, there's so many other ways of looking at it, because we can look at these simulated environments where the potential is huge.
Yeah. It's funny when you were describing the distractibility of a child, looking away at something and then looking at the kid. It brought back memories of my childhood. I think there's the old adage in psychology, we all study our weaknesses, may have inspired some of this work, because it was very challenging. My mom just gave me, she dug up my old report cards and from first to third grade, and I'm reading the teacher's comments about Albert seems to be interested in everything other than what I'm teaching, and has poor self-control, and it's like
Yeah, I never knew that about you, Skip. But George, I wanted to say, I'm sorry to take so much of the time, but the new headsets, some of them also have physiological measures. And George, that would be really cool to measure if the parent, their response changes, because you can get heart rate variability. I don't know how good it is in some of these headsets, but some of them have it. So
yes, the HP Omnisense headset,
right,
it's a sensor band that picks up heart rate.
Wow.
It tracks eye movement, but I'm not sure if that thing is marketing as well as they had hoped, because it really is a research tool. You know, your typical gamer isn't going to buy that.
Right.
But
we have them in the lab, so that's what we're using in the lab. But for home, they're using the Quest.
Yeah. Yep. Well, the beauty of all this is that these headsets are evolving. You know, you've got competition, you've got well-funded companies like Meta and other companies, and now Apple coming out with their version of a headset soon. And by the way, I've had discussions with Apple, and they're very interested in this area. The problem is that headset, the initial version, is going to be $3,500, and that's going back to the 2010 and below era, where it was very costly to get the equipment to do this. But hopefully those prices will come down. And really, a headset is a great opportunity for the eye movement. Think about how much money you spent on your Tobii system originally for eye tracking, and now that stuff is becoming standard in headsets.
Exactly.
So, George, from your perspective in the school systems, what is do you get any pushback, or do you get real interest? Do people get it, your colleagues, about what you're doing? Do you have to sell it, or is it like a light bulb going off that, yeah, VR makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think I have to do a lot of selling for a few reasons. One is I think they work with enough of kids with various challenges, including those with ADHD, to know that, we have to do better in terms of, this whole generalization phenomenon. The other thing is that a lot of the teachers that I end up working with now, even administrators, are of the generation that is very comfortable with technology and sees technology, in a positive context, as opposed to perhaps my generation, where people are more reluctant. The biggest challenge has been, cost, right? I mean, even with reduced cost as the technology advances, it's still competing, especially in some districts. Do we spend X number of dollars on VR versus textbooks, and so unfortunately it becomes a zero-sum game around that. I think that's, to be honest with you, I think the two challenges are, one, just bringing people up to speed on what could be done, which is, I think, very attainable, and the other is cost. But that hopefully will change over time, right?
Right. Do you ever see a time where a teacher may make a recommendation and the student goes down to, whether it's a guidance counselor's office or whatever, and puts on a $300 headset and does a quick, 10-15-minute screening test that might give some some sort of objective data on their attention performance? Do you think we see that day coming?
Yeah, I do, as well as other potential technologies. I do. I hope it happens during our careers. But yeah, I absolutely do. We work with we have a private school that for kids with emotion and behavior disorders. It's affiliated with Lehigh University, called Centennial School, and they this past year put in an IVR classroom in a classroom, so the kids will go in there and be immersed in various contexts, various environments, and they've used it for a variety of purposes. One, educational purposes, where the child is in an environment that underwater and sees various animals and so forth. But they've also used it as a calming environment, because these are kids with poor emotion regulation skills, and so they'll use the IVR room as a way to kind of detox. And now that's that's not a public school. It's a different type of population, but I can certainly see all of this on the immediate horizon. Really, the technology advances that we have.
Very interesting. What about we touched on it briefly on the front end here, but what about when you interact with a parent and you mention that you want to do this, whether it's for research or some kind of a clinical test, you want to use virtual reality? What do parents typically think that don't have a lot of familiarity with this sort of approach?
From my perspective, and we may be a self-selecting sort of population too, parents are very interested, but maybe that's because those are the parents who volunteer for our studies. I've had a number of families where they have their own VR headsets at home. So they're already doing that and engaged in it. And as time has progressed more and more, I'm learning that it's the parents that have them, but also their children are playing with them. They have their own VR games and so forth. So I feel like the parents are welcoming it and are comfortable. But again, that could be because of those are the people who are applying to be involved in our studies. That could be part of it. But I feel like it's seeping into the general community more anyway. Actually, as an aside, my son was, when he was applying to college several years back, one of the colleges he applied to sent him a cardboard VR headset and a link to a website to imagine himself being on the college campus.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
So that was about, 5 years ago or something.
Yeah, Google Cardboard, I think.
Yeah, and it was a public university on the West Coast.
Wow.
So already it's seeped into the culture in certain ways.
Yeah, fascinating. George, what about you? And
Yeah, similar, two things. One is, most of the parents we end up working with, obviously in our studies, are volunteers, and they know the aspect of the study would involve technology, so they're open to it. But I think there's also a generational component to it. I mean, the parents that we're working with in our early intervention study, now granted, they're parents of kids that are really young, 3, 4, and 5 years old, so their parents themselves are relatively young. They're very comfortable with technology, and I think they would question us if we didn't have some technology as part of what we're doing, right? I mean, they'd be like, what century are we in? So I have not had any pushback from parents.
what about sometimes people bring up ill effects or dangers or risks with using these kinds of things with children. What do you think on that? Are these manageable?
Well, I think what we learned from our experience is that there needs to be some oversight from the parents. That was our biggest concern. And indeed, we found some of the children were taking the headsets and they were playing other games on them than the games that we had loaded. So, and some of the children were more savvy probably than their parents about how to access those games. So that was what we learned, is that the parents needed to be more involved and providing some oversight. And for our next study, we are using parental controls. So the parents will have to put a passcode in before the child actually uses it. So that's the lesson that we've learned. That to us was concerning. That was the main concern that we've experienced.
This time is like flying. We got through 1/10 of the questions that we have. We're gonna have to do another podcast. This topic deserves a lot more time. But one question I like to ask everybody that comes on the podcast, and that is, if you were given an unlimited amount of money for 2 years to build out a VR system in whatever clinical area you wanted, what would you aim to do? George, want to take it?
Sure. I would just because I'm presently engaged in early intervention research. I would do two things. One is I would expand, the type of scenarios that we could present to parents to practice skills and make it as realistic as possible and integrate it, as firmly as we can into the existing behavioral parent training program, so that it's a seamless part of that program. And then the other thing that I would love to do is do a similar kind of thing with teachers, and whether those be early childhood teachers or K through 12. And because I don't know of anybody in our field who's doing that work with teachers presently, and I think that's a population where, again, for all the reasons that we've been talking about, would really benefit from it. So if I had unlimited resources, I would do both of those things to hit and support the very folks that we need to be implementing the strategies at the point of performance.
Yeah, Julie.
Right. I mean, same here. I would build out also the number of environments that we're working in from intervention and assessment perspective. So beyond the classroom, similar to what I mentioned earlier, the shopping, but I'm very interested in impulsivity. So also looking at what sort of environments anticipate impulsivity. And if we could teach individuals, because that's where you really need the point of performance, is that when somebody is going to do something impulsive, risk-taking behavior. So if we could simulate those sorts of environments and show people had different options, how they could respond. I'd expand the age range. We work a lot with adults with ADHD. So instead of the virtual classroom, the virtual office, which is maybe for some people their Zoom room now, maybe their children running by, their cats running by, so forth. And then for many years, we've been asked for, with the autistic population as well, to see if we would test out our work in that population. Right. So expanding it to that population. And in general, learning more about attention, impulsivity, and bringing other measures as well. So maybe some of the physiological measures too.
Last one, real quick one. I'm just adding this is one I'm going to be asking everybody. What about ChatGPT? What about AI? Is it something to be feared, or is it something that if we are ethical and professional, we can harness it?
Yeah, I don't think we have any choice other than to try to harness it. Because fear isn't going to get us anywhere. It's out there. People are going to be using it. We need to harness it in the most productive way. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, it goes back. I hate to beat the same drum. The point of performance, so we could be using. I'm thinking the classroom situation, right? So we could be using ChatGPT and generative AI to help with differentiated instruction, so that we're gearing instruction at the level that is optimal, so just to beyond their current capabilities, to be challenging enough to be of interest to kids with ADHD, could be tracking their on-task behavior and making decisions, quote unquote, about instruction delivery or behavior intervention delivery. Could be also, we could harness it to help parents and teachers to implement the most appropriate evidence-based strategy in the given moment based on, the model that the algorithms that we put in place. So there's vast potential, and we have no choice but to try to harness it in the best way we can.
Julie,
yeah, that's a great answer, George. I don't think I can. That's really well thought out, and so I love that idea of the potential. The only concern is, I think this is a general issue, is how do we know what's real and what isn't real, and teaching individuals how to detect the difference between that. And I think that's just, as a society, we need to be learned to be trained on having critical thinking about what we're doing. But
right. I think it can be a useful tool for decision support rather than decision making. I mean, maybe in some cases, but let's start off with, informing our decisions and trying to learn from the benefits of it. Because you're right, George. Fearing it is not going to get us anywhere. All right, Sherry.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Wow, this has been amazing. I just wanted to open it up for questions coming in from those participating. And so if you have a question, you can submit it in the Q&A section or in the chat. And for our panelists here, that includes Dr. Rizzo as well. So for Dr. DuPaul or Dr. Schweitzer, I'm sure you may have some questions out there. But in the meantime, I have a question for both of you, and that is that, actually for all three of you, I think, that is that you're all pioneers in this world of VR in terms of VR research. And I guess I would say, do you feel that there is enough being done right now around the research, or what's needed most in this field in order to advance and progress with VR in medical research? So, Dr. Schweitzer, do you want to take a stab at that one?
So what I'm learning is that there's more VR, it seems like, commercially available with maybe private industry than I've seen. What I've seen in the academic settings has been more limited. There's certainly some, and there may be plenty of work that I'm not aware of, But I feel like industry is really starting to take off with this. In some ways that's fantastic, but in some ways I really would like to see that they have a chief scientific officer, a chief medical officer who understands the complexities. And I think that's where there's been some challenges in general when it comes to tech and industry, is if they haven't had robust experts who were involved in the process, they've made some missteps that I think potentially it can be more harmful than helpful. So I think that's my response.
Great. Dr. DuPaul?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Julie. We have to be balanced in terms of how we move forward with this. But I think back to when I was in graduate school, again, decades ago, at the advent really of, personal computers and so forth. I can remember having discussions with my fellow graduate students and the faculty there about how technology has so much potential to support interventions for kids with ADHD for all the reasons we were talking about earlier. And it's actually amazing to me how little has been done over the succeeding decades, including by myself, to harness whatever technology du jour is available. We just really have not done enough, I don't think, in terms of using technology as a supportive tool around intervention in particular.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have a question from one of our attendees. Let me read it to you. It's how to give incentive to the child to grow or even try to adapt to VR classroom, since typically they expect games, but now met with what's seeming boring. So an incentive makes a huge difference in my experience with kids with ADHD. Is that the same observation you have? Dr. Schweitzer?
Yes. That was a challenge with some of the earlier cognitive training programs, is that initially they were exciting and interesting to children with ADHD. And then as more games proliferated, they were boring and they were work. And interestingly, we had a different reaction in the autistic population when we did the same games. They were much more used to the routine of it, and they were less bothered by the lack of novelty. So we've tried to take that into account. But I always keep in mind that we want generalization. And if we make everything in life a game, then how is that going to generalize to the real classroom? So the way we're approaching is that they have to do their tasks in the VR classroom, but then they can then engage in the games, just like good old fashioned behavior therapy. Once you complete your goal, then you get the reward. But taking that into account, taking ADHD into account, and what the requirements are for how long they'd be practicing the game and so forth, we've tried to be thoughtful about that.
Great, thank you.
I
Dr.
think
DuPaul? Oh, Skip.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, George.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Julie. It really comes back to what's the purpose? Like, if the purpose is to create an environment that is going to simulate the quote unquote real world so that we can see, the various challenges that the kid has, et cetera, then making it game-like is defeating that purpose, right? So it really depends on what the purpose is. If we want them to be learning some new strategies and learning some new skills, and we need to build in motivational components to that experience and incentives to that experience, then it makes sense to make it perhaps more game-like. So it really comes back to what is the purpose of the environment and of the experience to begin with.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think gamification is a panacea in these areas. It's an important element for certain things. If you can make a functional task that you have as a target, you can make it something that has some game elements, maybe something that gives you feedback on a score, and you can see how you performed compared to the previous time, or you can see how you performed compared to other kids your age. Maybe there's some elements to that. But I think the real art is going to be how do you take difficult challenges and gamify it to some point where you build a skill? Like I've always thought that, I don't know if you're familiar with the game Beat Saber, but it's a good eye-hand coordination activity. There's cognitive elements where you have to swipe a certain direction based on the arrows, but you could cognify it and, maybe turn it into a kind of a brain training. I hate to use that term, but you can turn it into an activity that is, like Julie was saying, like a reward, and intersperse that as part of how VR might be implemented to develop a focus where it's not so much a game, because life isn't always about having fun. Sometimes you got to kind of suck it up. But if you have these things to look forward to, or you get some positive strength developed in these game-like activities, maybe it carries over into helping you to do a better job on everyday mundane activities that we have to do probably 90% of our life.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for the response to that question. I think that you gave some really good insight to that. So, and I would like to once again thank you so much for joining this event in the Tech Meets Mental Health series. I hope you've learned from our amazing speakers today. Thank you, Dr. Schweitzer, Dr. DuPaul, and thank you again to our host, Dr. Rizzo. For our audience, the video recordings of this event will be available on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it with anyone who might be interested in the topic. We look forward to seeing you again at our next event and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again.